thanks very much, Eve, and it was very good of you to leave out those bits you were going to say, but I persuaded you not to. It's an incredible pleasure to be here and in this fantastic auditorium and to be at this sort of clockwork conference. It's works very well indeed, as well as any conference I can ever recall going to. And so it's a very great pleasure to be here. And I've been enormously enjoyed and been informed by all the presentations and sessions I've been able to attend. I've learned an enormous amount from the different forms and practices and individual collective outputs of education and the ways that they've been constructed. But my approach is going to be a little bit different from those that have gone before in the sessions that I've been in. It can be seen, fundamentally, I want to try and see it as based on the distinction that the ethnomethodologists, and I don't think there's anybody in this room probably who's old enough except me to know about ethnomethodology, but oh, thank you. And the ethnomethodologists' crucial distinction between topic and resource. The topic is focusing on an object because we want to understand it, to use it as a resource. It is something we can use to explain. The best example is, I think, PISA is a very good example. PISA is largely used as a resource. We take all that statistical stuff and we say that's how things are. If we make PISA a topic, then we want to investigate how it gets like this. We want to pull apart PISA. We want to see how it's constructed, what it means to whom, and what kinds of consequences it has. It's not enough just to treat it as a set of inert statistics that are unchallengeable. And so that's largely the approach that I shall be using. We want to know more about all these educational topics and claims, and we want to know from the angle of knowing why it works and who it works for and with what consequences for whom. And we don't do all those questions. To have a comprehensive understanding, it's boring and tedious, but we need to address all of them. And especially we need to think more thoroughly about what consequences for whom. Because that's where it stops. That's where taking something like PISA stops, when taking it as a resource stops. Now, one way of approaching this is, I've only ever written one blog in my life, and that was a year or two ago in NORAG News, which some of you may have come across. Not the best known, I'm sure, of sites. Anyway, I wrote in response to the famous claim made by Andreas Schleicher, the mastermind of PISA, that he said that without data, you are just another person with an opinion, he said arrogantly. I responded by saying, without theory, you are just another person with data, because data does not speak for itself. And we had a nice example of this, a sort of semi-parallel example of this, yesterday when Anne Hickling-Hudson drew attention to the fact that what is by almost any criteria the best education system in the world, Cuba, is not widely known or recognized or publicized, as a model, and it has nothing to do with the ignorance about it or with disagreements with it, but with the reluctance to accept or discuss or challenge the premises on which it's based. It's not a question just of the effectiveness, it seems to me, of the Cuban education system, but of a pervading ideology globally about what an education system should look like, which is something that somehow or other excludes the best system in the world. So, my aim is to try to open up discussion of what's meant by education and by and for whom and who benefits or fails to benefit from it, because it's clear that there's little agreement about this. There are two fundamental kinds of response to such questions, essentially those that are empirical descriptive, looking at how it works, and those that problematize or question it and don't take it for granted. And I apologize for the crudeness of this distinction, but I think it's one worth bearing in mind. So I'll refer in some part to a range of what I've called education questions. These include both asking what are the outputs. So here, outputs and outcomes is a little bit like like resource and topic. What are the outputs? The outputs of education systems are grades. Those grades lead in some way or other to the outcomes, what you can do with the qualification, what you can do with your understanding of education. And this is a key distinction that is often overlooked. And because fundamental to these questions is the recognition of the necessarily close relationship between education and the area of political economy. And so later on in this presentation, I'm going to refer to and use the example of one particular component of the SDGs, SDG number 7 at 4.7, which is about global citizenship education, and how that is related to the wider global market civilization advanced by major international organizations and the powers of global finance. A major and extremely important distinction that has to be made when we address issues such as the nature and significance of the SDGs internationally on a global scale is that the very terminology structures the ways that such issues can be understood. We are confronted by stacks of apparently similar terms for describing what's going on: globalization, regionalization, etc., with typically very little perceived need to distinguish between or elaborate on these themes. And it's part of my argument here that there are major and highly significant differences between the ways in which we refer to the supranational level, globalization, internationalization, world, regional, hemispheric, each of which individually seems in some way to narrow and define the scope of the activities they describe. And indeed, my first argument is that it's crucial to recognize that these characterizations derive from significant differences in the ways that we approach them analytically. And I know there are a lot of people here for whom English is not the first language. So for some of the more complex things, I've put up a written slide of what I'm going to say. And there's one here.
Do you want me to do that?
No, I don't mind just stepping across. Yeah. So they mean or imply different things, and as long as we fail to distinguish between them, for that time our analyses will be less than complete. So, to come down to brass tacks, I propose that we follow a threefold distinction for different bases of naming and pursuing the issues that confront us and the analytic consequences of that. Now, this distinction I've just made for the purpose of this presentation, but it's one that we might want to, it is one that is kind of a way of attempting to demonstrate how we might approach this rather than something set in concrete. So I propose that we follow a threefold distinction for the different bases of naming and pursuing the issues that confront us and the analytic consequences of that. And this is all part of the attempt to unpack and elaborate more effectively the concept of globalization. First of all, we take the label world. We take the label world as both noun and adjective, crucially. And it should be used to characterize, the best way, I think, of characterizing it is as the international system of states, which includes all members of the United Nations, as the most complete catalogue of the political entities making up and dividing the total population of the world into at least formally free and sovereign nation states. To be sure, there are a few exceptions to be considered here, such as, for instance, stateless people, but the existence of that distinction in itself demonstrates the pervasiveness and embeddedness of the category as a whole. Within this international sphere, many hugely significant transactions are carried out. But the fundamental basis on which the international system of states is based is that relations between these countries rest fundamentally on their membership of the United Nations and its constituent bodies. And while this in no way means that they are treated equally, or that their acknowledged countryhood and their recognition as a country remains the fundamental basis of their collective commonness. It is on the basis of their, I think there's one. You'll find, yeah. It's on the basis of their countryhood. I've lost it. Their nationhood, on the basis of their nationhood, which may or may not overlap with their countryhood. And the specific and highly relevant for the arguments I'm making later, status of individuals in the world is largely bestowed through the status of national citizenship, a status that we may see sometimes as being under challenge from the level of the global. However, beyond that formal equality, membership does not guarantee any particular level of participation or treatment. Between the international systems of states and individual nation states, we find increasingly another basis of multinational recognition and action, which occurs at the level of transnational regions. Interestingly, transnational regions are fundamentally a bureaucratic relation, a bureaucratic creation of the United Nations Statistics Department. There's nothing else to the basis of the global into regions. And so you get the ludicrous, seems to me, the ludicrous element of this. You're going to put, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dave. They resulted here in the incredible hybrid of a region that puts together Oceania and China. So below the level of the region, we have, of course, individual nation states with massively different capacities to impact the world. The significance of state interventions in and on the world creates a range of hierarchies that do not necessarily overlap. Take, for instance, North Korea's possession of nuclear capacity, but otherwise limited impact on the world. And the level of the nation state is still the main arena in which international politics takes place. It's through relationships between states that most of the world's formal cross-national political exchanges take place, while at the same time, the nation remains as the main repository of personal attachment and formally the basis of attachment through citizenship. The second way I want to, second element of this distinction I want to make is what I want to refer to as the planetary. More recently, an alternative way of conceiving and framing the transnational involves embracing it in a way that is quite distinct from the international system of states. That is, at the opposite end of the scale from the United Nations and its shaping membership conditions, the issues we are studying also include the planetary, which essentially constructs the planet itself as a complex and fragile whole, with Earth not reducible to, but nevertheless a victim of, human activity, especially as it's currently enacted. These tend to come to prominence with an accompanying assumption or hope that the members of the global community, itself very much a far from innocent way of conceiving of the whole, who crucially are not confined to the members of the UN with significantly and especially active national and international NGOs, will recognize and act on the understanding that the future of the planet represents a quite different set of issues from membership of the UN. Fundamentally, it seeks to override political boundaries of all kinds. It's also important to register here the idea of the common humanity of mankind, at one level represented in our common species being, and at another, and a large leap from here, from this basic species to its assumed shared and reciprocal claims to a set of fundamental rights that all mankind shares as part of that common humanity. As the Universal Declaration of Human Rights puts it, it involves the recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Family is an interesting word. It is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That should be about number 4, doesn't it? Thanks. However, the commonest and most prominent way of addressing these transnational issues is probably that we refer to the supranational sphere, is the global, understood in many different ways, even if the differences are not often fully investigated. And one interesting way of seeing how understandings and compositions of globalization emerge is to take as an extreme case the conception of globalization in the Icelandic language. The Icelandic language allows no imports from anywhere. And so words, concepts like globalization have to be invented from existing Icelandic resources. And as I understand it, the Icelandic word for globalization, it comes from the basic idea of a sleeve. Globalization is a sleeve. And it seems to me that's a very interesting way, extreme way of looking at globalization when you have to use existing resources to do it. Now, there are good reasons for this range of understandings. In particular, we should note that focusing on lenses such as the world leaves a massive remainder for understanding each of them separately from different perspectives. Neither the world nor the planet understandings pay much attention to the activities that most crucially shape our lives in the world and on the planet. And there's a good reason for making this distinction, because neither the world nor the planet has much to say about or much say over these activities. That is, those that drive economic activities. And it's not just the need to characterize the sphere and geographic spread of those activities that leads me to refer to them as belonging to the category global. But the nature of the activities that we have come to see as driving what we separately and collectively experience as shaped at this global level. The key point here is that the activities that make up the levels of the international, the planetary, and the global are seen through what we can describe as different lenses. That is to say, they see different worlds. They have a major focus on the way that goods, services, and activities and so on are distributed across the membership of the international community, including the ways that they are redistributed across and between national polities. In essence, they describe, often in great and interesting detail, which members of the international system of states and of the states that comprise it get what from the way that that international system of states works. There are two key ways in which these activities may be referred to as global. One is that they stretch far beyond and more deeply across the activities of the world, as I've just referred to it. The activities that we refer to as global are related to, but not reducible to, what goes on in the world. In a nutshell, what I mean by global refers to the scope of economic activities that take place on the planet and to the dominance it grants social imaginaries that emphasize necessity and obscure options for political choice. That is to say, these activities extend beyond and are scarcely controlled by the scope of individual states, but more by the rules of capitalist accumulation. The global does not represent the universal human interest. It represents a particular local and parochial interest which has been globalized through the scope of its reach. And one of the most effective ways of describing globalization, of catching the idea of globalization, is put forward by the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who says we have to recognize that there's no such thing as global. There are localized globalisms and there are globalized localisms. And so we can take, I always say, what we can take as a globalized localism, we can find in several forms, it seems to me, of music. In particular, reggae music coming from one small island in the Caribbean becomes a global phenomenon. It becomes globalized. And similarly, the global can be localized. So we should bear those things in mind. The 7 most powerful countries in the world, the G7, dictate global affairs, but the interests that guide them remain narrow, local, and parochial. So there is some element of political control over the conceptions of globalization. Any control that's exercised over them comes from what are very largely private international organizations, banks, firms, and so on, whose capacity to flourish even after the crash was evidence of their power vis-à-vis even the most powerful states. That's number 5 there. Yeah. 2 points should be made here. One, which is absolutely crucial to what I want to say. One is the question of equivalence, which is raised by the numerous different forms and practices taken by globalization. The clearest example here is the formal equivalence of all members of the UN at the level of the world. They all have one vote. It makes them all equivalent. The other is the formal equivalence of national education systems assumed and imposed by such mechanisms and modalities as PISA, which have come to be assumed by and accepted by a sufficiently large and influential number of countries who are in a position to impose these instruments. What this means, crucially, that it involves is treating entities that we know are different in significant ways as equivalent and comparable against a common global standard or set of standards. And in this case, that set of standards, PISA is the best example of this. It is a global set of standards because that's what it wants to be, and it recognizes no distinctions within all the people who follow it. It's also crucial to make a distinction between structural power, that is, the power to shape the perceived interests of others, and ideological power, the power to make certain institutions and conventions seem inevitable. And again, some of the responses to PISA really seem to demonstrate a form of ideological power to make these things seem real. And people respond to them as if they are real, that the rankings actually mean something. So, on the one hand, we see the enrolling of all the countries in the same sets of all countries in the same sets of transnational comparisons as creating a false but powerful sense of their comparability for the purposes at hand. However, and closer to the themes of this conference, we do find different understandings of these issues in the MDGs and SDGs. And the first question to be asked here is into which categories such activities fall. It seems to me clear that they are in formal conception much closer to the international. They are set up by the main international organizations, UNESCO, OECD, and so on, though we do need to recognize that those major international organizations, which we tend to lump together sometimes, themselves have very different goals and resources and act in very different ways for very different purposes. So OECD is a very different kind of organization from UNESCO. It is much more powerful. It is much better resourced. It has a much narrower target area of activity than UNESCO, which is in many ways the respectable face of international organizations. In the case of the MDGs, there's less sense of the structural causes of underdevelopment, which are associated with various differences mentioned here. Rather, we tend to find more or less undifferentiated conceptions of poverty and underdevelopment, with an absolute development goal in the form of universal primary education. That is to say, there is no recognition of or response to the globally generated structural, political, economic causes of underdevelopment, which SDG targets 10.5 and 10.6 address in identifying the global level responsibility to address such inequalities. Similarly, but somewhat in contrast, the SDGs seek inclusive and equitable quality education, though this itself can be interpreted in different ways. This is a very important example of the differences between the two approaches, and especially the potential of not treating all at-risk countries as if they were identical for all main purposes. Crucially for the argument here, the SDGs introduce an idea of relativity, and we can see strong justification for that in Philip McMichael's very neat argument that while development once meant, presumably in the MDGs, while development once meant improvement on the past, it now refers to, in the SDGs, how to make the future. More than this, Eloise Weber has drawn attention to the key distinction within SDGs, to the key distinction between entitlement and goals. The former, entitlements, are fundamental rights that ought not to be denied to anyone and should be politically protected and secured. By major contrast, goals are aspirations that may or may not be realized. Access to them is typically through markets, very different from an entitlement. And if we look at the wording of the aims and intention of the goals, it seems very unlikely that everyone will be able to realize their entitlements. Weber also introduces the ladder metaphor, where inequalities are effectively conceived of in terms of rungs on a ladder. The ladder facilitates the relative comparison of goal attainments, but also permits the continuous deferment of reaching substantial goals for the society, because development is always conceived relative to whomever or whatever occupies the upper rungs. That was 7 and 8. These are very important steps, and it's a key point of my argument. In particular, they enable us to locate the global itself as a particular normative filter, as representing a standard of civilization. And the central argument probably of this paper is that the global has come to connote civilization, not in terms of its scope, but as a marker of the desirable global standard of civilization, of what it is to be civilized, which is a huge claim. The concept of a standard of civilization is necessary to the globalization debate because it provides the basis from which peoples and states are morally ranked on the basis of an assumption of equivalence according to their capacity to fit within global marketization. Historically, the standard of civilization has been the basis for the rankings of peoples right back to its origins. The origins of the idea of standard of civilization was as a legal mechanism designed to set the benchmark for the ascent of non-European states to the ranks of the civilized family of nations and their full recognition under international law. And the way that this originally worked was the criterion used to bestow the standard of civilization was to say things like, if one of from the central countries, from the Western countries, if one of our citizens happens to be held by another country, will they return him or her? And that things like this became the standard of civilization. And of course, this extends more and more to, can you do trade with them? But this standard of civilization, ceteris paribus, still remains. So that it means, in a sense, rather than being uncivilized, we might say that these countries are now unglobalized because they do not conform to the standards of civilization contained in, for instance, neoliberalism. However, this is far from the end of the story. First of all, we need to recognize how any particular marker of a standard based on equivalences inevitably brings about further forms of inequality. It is equality for the winners. I want to focus in the remainder of this presentation then on one particular mechanism and modality put forward through the ODGs. It is one single target among several others in SDG 4. And it's one of the most far-reaching and ambition of the whole set of SDG 4. It is the SDG 4.7, which focuses on, whose topic is global citizenship education. The wording of the goal states that by 2030, we should ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and culture's contribution to sustainable development. That's pretty ambitious by any standards. both in intended content, but also in the intended outcomes of that content. Because the hope and the intention and the effort is to make it a basis of equivalence, to make it the basis of the standard of civilization to which all will have to conform. And I think that this does represent a distinct new modality of global governance of education. In the terms used above, the power of 4.7 is both structural, the power to shape the preferences of others, and ideological, the power to make certain interests and conventions seem inevitable. And it's on the latter that I'll be focusing in discussing the ideal of the GCA. To put it in a nutshell, I shall be arguing that in the case of the global citizenship education, it means not a geographical spread, but the inculcation of a common standard as a common standard or norm for the behavior and states of states and individuals everywhere. And more than this, I want to suggest that the content of that standard is a form of global market civilization to accompany and buttress the power and reach of the global economy. Historically, that standard of civilization, as I said, was a legal mechanism to benchmark the ascent of non-European states to the civilized family of nations. What we're seeing, I think, is an attempt to move in that direction now at the level of the global economies. Some key points need to be made about this. It applies to the whole world, to all learners, not just the global south. That is, the standard of global citizenship is a massive and novel aspiration on a global scale. And the point here is that, again, the language is so difficult. I don't know if it's the same in other language, because we have global meaning space. But here, I want to say we have global meaning a kind of norm. We're not talking about a global space, we're talking about a global norm, a global standard which operates. An absolutely central question then in respect of 4.7 concerns what constructs of global are in play. I've already referred to its relational nature, but it should be clear that the phrase represents a potentially conflicting set of concepts. What are the relationships between global citizenship and education? Very clear difficulties appear at both practical and conceptual levels. So, very simply, citizenship has historically been taken as a national issue. Nation states possess the authority to determine who shall be entitled to what benefits of civilization. Here, global citizenship becomes a clear issue, as does citizenship education, evident in the wide number of forms it takes. And finally, we come to the most challenging of all, global education. The problem lies in the possible qualifiers of global. Does it mean every member of every education system? The concept of a standard of civilization is necessary to the globalization debate because it provides the basis from which peoples and states are morally ranked according to their capacity to fit within global marketization. So, finally, what I want to suggest is the global standard does not necessarily prescribe the content of global citizenship education, but only the standard, if you like, the set of norms that it is to encapsulate and advance. My argument here intends a clear departure from the kinds of debates generated by combining the three, and possibly more, constructions of global citizenship education and their forms and consequences for whom. 4. Is the purpose of global citizenship education that it will be equally applicable to everyone in the same way. My argument here is that whether or not it is intended in this way, the essence of global citizenship education does not and could not really inhere in its context, but it's an attempt to provide a global standard and basis for ranking countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. He's always had the ability to get the mind buzzing. I invite Professor Keita Takayama to respond. Do you want to come up? Oh.
What a challenging task to respond to Roger's argument. But it's an honor to be tasked. Just not even 2 days ago, so all of a sudden, out of the blue, I was asked to be to provide a response to Roger's keynote speech. And it's an honor because, as Eve said so clearly, Roger has been so influential in social education and scholarship on education policy. And I have been immensely influenced by his scholarship. His 1989, is that correct? The book called The State and Education Policy has always been my Bible. If you want to understand how state operates in education policy, you really have to read the book. So it's an absolute honor to provide my response to Roger's keynote speech. So now that I've said all the good things about Roger, I can be a bit critical, I suppose. So I get some freedom to be what I want to say. So to me, Roger presented a provocative and much needed interpretation of SDGs. In particular, its 4.7 goal as closely related to what he calls global market civilization. Global market civilization, as I understand it, refers to the emerging modality of global governance where the globe is reconstituted as a space of equivalence or commensurability, where standard assumes enormous normative power, and where individuals and states are morally ranked according to their capacity to fit within the global market economy. In a sense, this is a new iteration of colonial discourse of the late 19th and early 20th century, where the standard of European civilization was used to rank people and cultures around the world along their historical progression towards Western modernity. Roger argues that SDG serves as an ideological tool. It constructs a particular parochial interest of handful economically powerful states, G7, and for-profit corporation as universal and inevitable. Hence, SDG generates a normative pressure on a global scale. His analysis provides a much-needed political economy analysis of SDG, which I would argue has been rather muted, if not completely absent, in the discussion thus far in this conference. The very critique of global capitalism in relation to sustainable or unsustainable development has been an elephant in the room, as Anne Hicklin-Hudson put it in our very private conversation, and I just made it public, sorry. After all, sustainable economic social development will remain far from achievable when unregulated predatory global capitalism supported by powerful states and international organizations continue to exploit people and destruct natural environment for excessive profit-making. So it seems to me that given that to raise this issue in New Caledonia is more than appropriate given its French colonial history, as David Small's paper, which was included as part of the conference package, and I hope you have had a chance to read that small piece of paper in there, as the paper testifies, the French colonization of New Caledonia beginning in 1853 was driven by the desire to access the extraordinary reserves of nickel. So along with other human and natural resources extracted from other French colonies around the world, it provided the essential backbone for economic growth and prosperity of French at the turn of the century. Like we need to recognize that. But the question I have to Roger is really whether or not SDG and its 4.7 goal is simply about incorporation of the world into global market economy. Here, just to remind everyone, I quote the 4.7 goal. This is what it says. By 2030, to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, I'll come back to that notion later, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. It's hard to argue against it, isn't it? It's wonderfully written. I don't think it's well written, but all the good words are in there. The international policy framework and goals such as SDG are, to me, the outcome of political contestation and compromises amongst the participating countries and their competing interests, though they still reflect and embody uneven power relationship amongst the participating countries. So clearly some countries have more say than others. And as we learned yesterday's keynote by Professor Kanai Simons, her concerns were not taken seriously in the SDG deliberation. We know that Japan was very instrumental in pursuing the SDG agenda, hosting many, many international symposiums meetings. The inclusion of brief reference to global citizenship in 4.7 was actually a political move that Japan made to appease the Korean representative who would otherwise have opposed to SDG, but had been campaigning hard for global citizenship education. So the point that I'm making here is that SDG is not a coherent document and should not be treated as such. And it embodies tensions and contradictions, mess of politics. And to acknowledge this is very important because it indicates possibilities for intervention. It is the gaps and cracks and vagueness created by such tensions and contradictions that allow those of us, including someone like Professor Kabini Sangha from Wellington, that I had the pleasure of speaking to over lunch yesterday. Someone like us and him who operate within the SDG goals and framework to perform creative rearticulation work, that is to recontextualize, often very radically, the so-called universal goals and frameworks in a manner that actually addresses the issues that people face, that is the consequences of economic, social dispossession caused by global capitalism. So I believe that the SDG goals, as Roger so rightly points out, include many concepts such as citizenship, justice, sustainable economic growth, that are perhaps quite purposely left undefined, so that it actually accommodate divergent political economic interests. Hence, they are sliding signifiers which can quite possibly be articulated to achieve a set of goals that can actually challenge the present economic order, I believe. So returning to your question, Roger, what consequences SDG might have and for whom? The answer to that question, to me, remains highly contested. Thank you.
I've just made an executive decision. We will continue this session just for another 15 minutes and try and recoup the time in morning tea and lunch, okay? Questions? Stefan, have we got a wandering? Oh, good. Any questions? Comments? I'm sure that, like me, you're fairly overwhelmed by the richness of what we've just heard, but we welcome any comments, any questions. Given what Roger said, also what Katie said, it's highly contested, there are spaces.
Kill the conversation.
You have killed the conversation. Okay. I'll invite, okay, dear Amandi. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Roger, for this presentation. And thank you also to explain us, and you should go to France to explain to our education ministry why the France rank for PISA is so low. And we have every year so bad results. Yeah, they are worse and worse, getting worse. Thank you. I was very interested by the differences that you made between those definitions, world, planetary, and global. And do you even know that in among the French geography researchers, they are using two different words also to talk about globalization, which are globalization and more financial way of thinking about the markets, and another one which is mondialisation with kind of worldization, which is more about the geographic meaning, the links between territories. So my question is, how can we understand ourselves if even in our own languages we have such big differences for a big word such as globalization?
Thanks very much. I mean, that is one of the key questions. It means so many things. And the consequence of that is that we have to be much more precise what we mean each time we say it. We cannot, if somebody says globalization does this or that affects global, that's insufficient. We have to break this down and say, what is it that we call globalization? What is it that it does that makes it have particular consequences? So, for instance, one way we might look at, and I think it's very useful, might look at globalization is by looking at the activities of, on the one hand, international firms, and on the other hand, of large international organizations. So, if we look at education, who is possibly the largest global supplier of education in the world? The Chinese government, perhaps, but beyond that, who is it? No? Well, they're second, probably. It's Pearson's. It's Pearson's publishing company. It's publishing companies now. If we look at the way that education is done, for instance, in predominantly, I think, in Africa, through something called low-cost public schooling, low-cost public education. Low cost means you pay a little bit of money, You get, in some cases, what you might call a curriculum in a box. It's just taken around. The teaching is usually done by 15 to 17-year-old girls who have some level of literacy and so on. This is done for profit by this major international company. They determine what it does. We get the limit case of this, that the whole of the education system of Liberia has been outsourced to a private company. A private American country runs the education system of Liberia. So that's one thing that globalization means within education. What the other thing I was going to say was what? Can you remind me again?
How can we do if we put different words?
Yeah, well,
behind this big word globalization, do we need to define every time we take?
I think we do, because otherwise people get away with murder. We say this is global, so in both directions. So we can say in a very kind of passive way, nothing we can do, it's all globalization. On the other side, we can say everything that's bad is globalization. What it means is it forces us analytically, that's our job as academics, it forces us analytically to say, what does it mean in any particular case? And we can look in any particular case. And so we can look in the case here of how does the conception of market civilization get spread? We can see this. We can see that organizations, a wide range of public organizations, use the conception now to gloss what it is that they're doing. Even people like the IMF say they're contributing to global civilization in some way or other. Now, what that forces us to do is to look at what global civilization means. But it also, if you like, leads me to be suspicious, Cater, of the way that it's used in 4.7, that it can mean almost anything, and the fact that, and it also has the great strength and quality of sounding good. Cosmopolitanism, for instance, is the basis of much of this stuff. And the cosmopolitan market civilization, if you like, is what I think is behind a lot of this. And that merely cosmopolitan doesn't mean a global understanding of the world. It means a very located understanding of the nature of the world. So we can become paranoid. That's probably going too far, but we should not cease to be suspicious.
Thank you, Roger.
There was somebody at the back.
Kia ora, Roger. My name's Martin. I'm from Wellington. I wonder if you could comment on any tensions you can see between the way individual nation states narrativize their PISA results and then generate policy as a result of it, and the kind of the general move towards comparative comparison as a way of organising our thinking about education in international sense, and also whether or not those things articulate with the idea of moral ranking that you discussed.
Absolutely, and I think that these the PISA results thing represents a real challenge to comparative education. Because if we take PISA at face value, then what we get, it is in a sense quite the opposite. The use of comparison in PISA is totally different from the use of comparison that we are employing when we analyze things and when we do our work. It is the fact that the comparison is made competitive, and it is competitive comparison that is the mechanism that drives states to change what's going on. This is where the principle of equivalence is exactly crucial. No difference is made between the richest and the poorest, the biggest and so on. All are ranked. And there's the even more remarkable one, which has been going on for a number of years, is the World Bank's, it's an index of readiness to become a global economy. And it concerns, and it involves every country in the world. And countries in the world on this readiness to become a knowledge economy are ranked from 1 to, I think, 138. And you can see, and the number 138 are supposed to learn implicitly from this how to get to be number 1. I mean, it is ridiculous competitive comparison. So I think that is the real problem with the way that PISA is used. And I don't know whether it's intended, and if it's just opportunistic, but it's certainly extremely effective, because we just look at the way governments say, why aren't we doing this? It's the same way that we get ranking of higher education institutions. And we see ministers of education all over the world and prime ministers saying, I want 3 universities from this country in the top 10 in the world within the next 5 years. And they're all saying it. And it becomes nonsensical. The competition, so the ranking is one thing, but the basis of the ranking is the other thing. If the basis of the ranking was on something worthwhile, it would be okay. It's not. It is only on the basis of tests that are intended to rank in particular categories.
Thank you. Helen, thank you, Martin. Helen?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation this morning. I think this is an important debate, but I think it's not actually all that new, because I recall in the days even around the battle for Seattle when certain people were called anti-globalisation protesters, yes. And they said, no, we're not anti-globalisation, we're just anti-neoliberal globalisation. And a movement was set up called the World Social Forum in competition with the World Economic Forum at Davos, which was happening about then. And they really distinguished between internationalisation and globalisation, and the sort of international solidarity that you had, or globalisation from below, as opposed to globalisation, which many people defined as the removal of national boundaries for international capital, but not for people. And so, you know, there was a big recognition that globalisation is, you know, as our friend said, it's an extension of the colonial exercise under a new name. But I think what is extremely interesting about the Sustainable Development Goals is that you had the bottom-up globalisers also able to play a part in the negotiation of those goals, in that you had the women's movement coming out of the 4 women's conferences, you had the environment movement coming out of the environment conferences, you had the trade union movement and the cooperative movement and other social movements who really lobbied to get the ultimate, so that it wasn't the SDGs, in contrast to the MDGs, are a very different kettle of fish. And I think and a great opportunity, as you say. I mean, I fully agree. A great opportunity for educationalists.
Yeah.
Hi, I've got one very simple question. So when did actual grading of students begin?
I don't know if we've ever found Plato's Mark book, but maybe.
Yeah. I was just interested to know when it began, by whom, and what the consequences for whom, going back to your initial question.
I've never looked into the history of it, but it is probably, this ranking is probably the most powerful tool that we've had across education systems, but certainly over the course of this country. Because it is a way of placing responsibility for success and failure on the individual and not on the system. If you are bright, the education system will recognize that and reward it. If you are stupid, the education system will make sure that you don't benefit unfairly. And it is offered as a fair recognition. But all we need is the old metaphor of saying that you have a race between me and Usain Bolt, and we both start at the same time. And I think Usain would finish just second, but not very far behind. And no attempt to equalise these things. There have been attempts to equalise it, but the attempts to equalise it never go far enough. And there is a big debate, and part of that should have come in here, about the difference between relational and distributional conceptions of education equality. And the relational ones focus on relevant categories and their combinations as related to education systems and so on. So I don't know when it started, but it seems very unlikely that it will end.
No.
Thanks very much, Roger, and thank you, people who asked questions. We're just going to complete this session. Fellow Aotearoans, we're going to claim Roger's local citizenship. One of his local citizenships. Come on, Kiwis, we're just going to fly out around cheek.
Does this one involve me doing it?
No?
I sit on the front.
Or you can come down here.
All right.